Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego hums with the particular frequency of fluorescent lights at 5 in the morning, that low electrical whine that only the night shift ever really hears. Margaret Walsh pushes through the ICU doors at 4:57 a.m., exactly 3 minutes early, the way she has for 1,247 consecutive shifts. Her scrubs are pressed. Her badge photo shows no smile. Around her neck, barely visible beneath the collar, hangs half of a broken dog tag chain, the metal worn smooth from 2 decades of being carried, the other half long ago given away. She moves through the ward with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this work so long it has become a second language. The slight limp in her left leg, the one that catches only when she's tired, the one that no one ever comments on, telegraphs nothing. Across the ICU, monitors beep in their steady, reassuring rhythm. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath in Bay 4. In Bay 2, an elderly man's oxygen saturation numbers climbed on the screen, 88, 91, 94. Stable. The way Margaret preferred all things. She began with the charts, running through the overnight reports with the kind of attention that was almost surgical. Fluid intake. Urine output. Heart rhythm tracings. Each number told her a story. She had learned, long ago in a place whose name she never spoke aloud, that data was information, and information was survival. At 5:23 a.m., she began rounds, starting with Bay 1, a 68-year-old with congestive heart failure, waiting for a transplant that might never come. She checked his full line, repositioned it slightly to ease the catheter angle, the movements so precise and economical that they looked like choreography. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that comes not from nursing school, but from something far older and far more difficult. She'd learned these movements in field hospitals, under mortar fire, with blood on her boots and lives hanging by threads she would not let break. By 6:30, the morning shift began filtering in. The sounds of the hospital shifted, fewer footsteps now, more voices. A coffee machine gurgled. A door slammed somewhere down the corridor. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum a little louder, as if the building was waking up and becoming itself. At 6:45, Dr. Richard Caldwell arrived for his rounds, his white coat still crackling with newness, his shoes gleaming with the shine of a man who had never had to run through mud in them. He was 54, handsome in the way that money and power create handsomeness, a certain polish, a certain assumption that the world had been arranged specifically for his benefit. His voice was the kind of voice that had never been questioned in a room. Until yesterday. Margaret was checking the morphine dosage on the board when the Hendersons arrived, the visiting board member and his wife, come to see his father in Bay 3. The old man's breathing had been labored. His pain management had been the subject of discussion. Caldwell breezed into the room with the confidence of a man who had never met a problem his credentials couldn't solve, and Margaret watched from her station as he began calculating the new morphine regimen. She could read it from where she stood. 50 micrograms per kilogram per hour. The numbers were bright and terrible in their wrongness. For a patient this size, the chart said 98 kilos, that calculation would deliver 4.9 milligrams per hour. The correct dose was 3.2. The difference between comfort and respiratory depression. The difference between healing and something far worse. She waited. This was important. Caldwell finished his explanation to the Hendersons, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man explaining something simple to people who couldn't quite grasp it. The wife asked a question about side effects. The husband nodded, satisfied. When they looked toward the window, when the moment was right, Margaret moved. She approached with her tablet, her voice pitched at the volume of someone asking a clarifying question rather than correcting a superior. "Doctor, I want to confirm the morphine calculation." She showed him the screen. 4.9 versus 3.2. The numbers glowed between them like a confession. His face didn't change. That was the remarkable thing. His expression remained exactly as it was, pleasant, benevolent, in control. But something in his eyes shifted. Something dark and immediate and cold as a switch being thrown. She saw it register. Not the error. The fact that she had seen it. the fact that there was now a witness to his seeing that she had seen it. He took the tablet from her hand with fingers that were very steady, and he looked at the numbers with the expression of a man examining evidence at a crime scene. "I appreciate the double check," he said. His voice was pleasant. Warm, even. Good catch. Nursing attention to detail. That's what keeps these patients safe. He adjusted the number on the screen with his index finger. 3.2 milligrams. Correct. Fixed. He handed the tablet back to her, and his smile never wavered. But when he looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in 3 years, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't anger. It was worse. It was the look of a man who had just realized that someone he'd been dismissing as furniture had just proven to have eyes. The Hendersons came back into the room. Caldwell greeted them with renewed warmth, explaining that he'd adjusted the medication for optimal patient comfort. Everything was fine now. Everything was handled. He didn't look at Margaret again during the rest of the round, but she felt the weight of that non-look. She felt it the way soldiers feel the moment when a room's acoustic properties change, when someone has put their hand on a trigger. The round finished at 7:04. Caldwell made 3 phone calls before 7:35. The first call came from his office, behind a closed door. Margaret was in the break room, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when she heard the muffled sound of his voice through 2 walls and a hallway. She didn't try to hear the words. She already knew what had happened. She had watched it happen 1,000 times in 1,000 different places. A man's authority questioned. A man's image cracked. A man deciding, in that moment, what he was going to do about it. The second call came from the parking garage. She heard it on the overhead pager, a coded message requesting a callback. The third call came from somewhere she couldn't identify, but she heard his voice again, lower this time, and when he emerged from wherever he'd been, his expression had reset itself into something that looked almost like anticipation. That afternoon, the air in the ICU seemed to change. It wasn't anything anyone could point to, anything visible or concrete. But it was there. The way the room felt different when you walk into someone's house and realize, without knowing why, that something fundamental has shifted. Margaret continued her work. She checked vitals. She updated charts. She was as invisible as she'd ever been. But something had changed in the way people looked at her, or rather, in the way they looked away. A nurse she'd worked with for 18 months suddenly had somewhere else to be when Margaret approached. Another turned her back when Margaret walked past. By 2 o'clock, there was a perceptible chill in the unit, the kind that precedes a storm. At 3:15, Caldwell called a brief meeting in Conference Room B. Nothing formal. Just a quick huddle. Margaret wasn't invited. She learned about it from overhearing a conversation between 2 residents, and she didn't ask questions. She simply continued her work, moving through the ward with the same quiet efficiency she'd always maintained. Her hands remained steady. Her voice, when she needed to use it, remained level and professional. She had learned, in a place very far away and very long ago, that maintaining composure in the face of incoming fire was not a choice, it was survival. The day finished at 7 o'clock. She clocked out at 7:03, the 3 minutes of unpaid time she always worked. Her locker held a single change of clothes, a protein bar, and a photograph she never looked at. She didn't open it now. She simply changed into street clothes, folded her scrubs with precise, deliberate creases, and placed them in her locker for tomorrow. Outside, the San Diego evening was clear and warm. The parking lot sprawled beneath sodium vapor lights. She walked to her truck, a Tacoma from 2011, nothing fancy, nothing that drew attention, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. She could see the reflection of her face in the rearview mirror, mid-50s, weathered, unremarkable. The kind of face people forgot instantly. The kind of person who could walk into a room and walk out again and no one would be able to describe her afterward. This had always been useful. She had learned to make herself small, to take up only the space she needed, to be the kind of woman that men like Caldwell saw through rather than at. But in the safety of the cab, in the growing darkness, her expression shifted. Her jaw tightened. Her hands, which had spent the entire day completely still, began to tremble, not with fear, but with the specific kind of restraint that comes from knowing exactly what happens when you stop holding back. She reached for the dog tag beneath her shirt, the half-chain that hung empty, and held it for a moment between her fingers. The metal was warm from her skin. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to. She could see it perfectly well in the darkness, the other half, the one that belonged somewhere else, the one that had been carried through 20 years by someone whose name she did not allow herself to speak aloud. Then she started the truck and drove home. The next morning, the humiliation began in earnest. Room 347. Third floor. An elderly cardiac surgery patient, 73 years old, recovering from a triple bypass 2 days prior. His daughter sat in the corner chair, her son-in-law standing near the window, both watching the monitors like sentries. Margaret was checking the patient's incision site when Dr. Caldwell swept in with a medical student trailing behind him, the kind of student who still believed every word from an attending was scripture. Caldwell didn't greet the family. He held up the chart and raised his voice just enough to carry through the room. "Nurse Walsh, can you explain why you documented this patient received 10 milligrams of Lasix when I clearly ordered 20? His tone was a scalpel, precise and intended to draw blood. Or can you simply not read my handwriting?" Margaret straightened. Her jaw tightened, just barely, just a muscle contracting beneath skin. One measured breath. In. Out. She didn't flush. She didn't look away. Her voice came steady as a metronome. "Doctor, your order says 10 milligrams. The patient's renal function is borderline. BUN is elevated at 28. I reviewed the parameters before administering. Are you contradicting me?" Caldwell's voice pitched higher, performative outrage designed for audience. "In front of a patient's family? This is exactly the kind of insubordination I've been documenting." The daughter's face reddened. The son-in-law shifted his weight. They'd come to Sacred Heart expecting expertise, not a power struggle over their father's bed. Margaret felt something behind her eyes, that burning sensation, the one she'd trained herself to recognize and suppress 20 years ago. One tear escaped. Just one. She lifted her hand and wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her movements deliberate as a surgeon's. When she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave, carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. "I know exactly what my place is, doctor. It's wherever my patients need me." The silence lasted 3 seconds. The medical student looked at his shoes. The daughter stopped breathing. Caldwell smiled. That was the worst part, the smile. It meant he'd gotten what he wanted. "That's the attitude problem right there, nurse." He gestured to the student. "Remember this moment. This is what happens when just a nurse doesn't know her place. There's a hierarchy in medicine for a reason." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "From now on, I'm requiring all your documentation to be reviewed by the charge nurse before charting. Clipboard, that's all you're qualified to hold." He was gone before Margaret could respond. She didn't look at the family. She adjusted the four-tubing instead, her hands moving through the motions of care like muscle memory, because that's what it was. She'd held steady under far worse, in places where screaming was background noise and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with copper blood became the smell of Tuesday afternoon. The patient reached out and squeezed her wrist. His daughter was crying. Margaret left the room and made it to the supply closet before she allowed herself to breathe like a human instead of a machine. But she didn't cry. Not there. Not anywhere they could see. The next day, she sat down in the break room with her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at 5 in the morning, a bottle of water, a handful of almonds. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, that peculiar hospital odor that never fully left your clothes. She'd chosen the center table deliberately, the one where the day shift congregated. Open. Visible. She was going to occupy space without apology. Within 15 seconds, 4 nurses rose simultaneously as if responding to a silent alarm. They gathered their trays with studied casualness, talking about the weather and hospital politics, carefully not looking at her. Their exodus was coordinated and absolute. The older ones left first: Sarah, who'd worked nights with Margaret for 2 years, Jennifer, who'd borrowed her stethoscope last month, Patricia, who'd shared a ride home on rainy days. They moved to a different table, their laughter resuming on cue. Margaret sat alone in the center of the break room, a radius of empty chairs around her like a plague vector. She ate slowly, chewed her sandwich methodically, drank her water. Hand steady, eyes forward. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above her head. Someone's phone buzzed. A microwave beeped. These sounds filled the spaces where conversation should have been. She didn't flinch. She didn't leave early. She finished every bite. By the following morning, Caldwell had moved beyond social theater. The unit board in the ICU break room bore a new notice, typed on official hospital letterhead and highlighted in bright red marker. Disciplinary notice. Employee, M. Walsh. Date, this date. Violation, insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. Recommended action, termination pending review. Signed, Dr. Marcus Caldwell, attending physician. Her name was highlighted in neon red. Not just circled. Highlighted. As if the color would make the shame more visible. Other nurses read it as they passed, then looked away when she approached. One of them, Marcus, a male nurse who'd complimented her care of a septic patient 3 weeks ago, actually turned his back and walked toward the med room when Margaret entered. The message was clear and wasn't meant to be subtle. Caldwell had weaponized protocol. He'd made her professional failure public and made her ostracism institutional. Margaret photographed the notice with her phone before removing it from the board. Evidence. Muscle memory again. You documented everything. Documentation was survival. During afternoon rounds, Caldwell arrived with a different medical student, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. He positioned himself outside room for 12, where Margaret was checking a patient's dressing. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't attempt discretion. This is what happens when just a nurse doesn't understand her limitations, he said, loud enough to carry through the unit. The student's eyes widened with the specific discomfort of a witness to injustice who isn't sure if she's supposed to say something. They develop delusions of competence. Think they can override physician orders. This one refused a direct command yesterday and tried to gaslight me about a medication order. He shook his head, the picture of disappointed authority. There's a reason we have a hierarchy in medicine, Sarah. Remember that. The student nodded, looking at her shoes. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for a patient chart. Just for a moment, a brief, involuntary shake. She pressed her palm flat against the counter and held it there, feeling the cool formica ground her. The dog tag chain beneath her scrubs had gone cold against her collarbone, metal that had been warm from a different body 20 years ago. She steadied her breathing the way she'd been taught in a tent in Helmand Province, the way they'd trained her before sending her back into fire. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. 4 counts each. She continued her work. She didn't cry. She didn't leave. She didn't defend herself. She simply existed in the space he was trying to erase her from, present and functional and unreachable. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. At 0300, the trauma alert pierced through the ICU like a siren cutting through a quiet night. The intercom crackled with urgency. Level 1 trauma. Inbound 5 minutes. Green Beret military transport. Chest wound. Unconscious. Radio static, then a voice confirming coordinates. Margaret's entire body went rigid. She was at the central station, charting on the computer when the alert hit. Her fingers stopped moving. Her breath stopped moving. Everything stopped except her heartbeat, which suddenly hammered like it was trying to escape her chest. green beret. Chest wound. Military transport. She stood. Sat back down. Stood again. The other nurses were already moving, the choreography of trauma response taking over, cleaning beds, setting up monitors, pulling crash carts closer like weapons being readied. The smell of the unit changed, became sharper, the way air changes before a storm. Margaret moved with them on muscle memory, but her hands weren't entirely here. Part of her was in a tent with canvas walls flapping in wind like something alive, stitching a jaw that wouldn't stop bleeding. The bay doors opened. Paramedics came through like a controlled explosion, moving around a stretcher at speed. A body, covered in blood and field dressings, unconscious and pale. Vitals being called out, BP 92/60, heart rate 128, O2 sat 84 on 10 liters, carotid pulse thready, chest wound anterior left with visible hemorrhage. Dr. Caldwell arrived. The colonel was transferred to a bed in the ICU's main bay, the brightest room, the one reserved for the sickest patients. Margaret watched from the corner. She was supposed to be assigned to him. He was green beret, military personnel, the kind of patient who needed someone who understood the specific geography of trauma. She moved toward the bed. "Nurse Walsh," Caldwell said, his voice sharp as a blade. "I need you on the post-op recovery patient in room 409. We need experienced staff here, not someone with a disciplinary record." She turned to respond, her mouth already forming words, but he was already calling for another nurse. "Sarah, I need you on the colonel's intake. Get a full panel, type and cross for units, fast exam now." Sarah nodded and moved toward the bay without looking at Margaret. Margaret stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned toward room 409. She didn't let her hands shake until she was alone in that room, adjusting a pillow that didn't need adjusting, until she could press her palms against the cool bedside table and breathe. The dog tag chain beneath her scrubs felt heavier than it should have. Her breath steadied against the cool tile of the supply closet. Margaret's hands released the inventory clipboard and found the dog tag chain beneath her scrubs, still there, still warm against her sternum. 20 years. The scar on his jawline had aged into something more weathered, more carved, but unmistakable. That jawline belonged to a 19-year-old private named Reeves who'd been screaming when she pulled him from the Humvee's burning chassis in Helmand Province, his uniform soaked in diesel and blood, shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder and face. She'd stitched him in a field hospital with trembling hands, not from fear but from the knowledge that if she didn't, he wouldn't make it past dawn. Now he was unconscious in bed 7, and Dr. Caldwell had made absolutely certain Margaret would never touch him. The restructuring had been surgical. At 0800 this morning, Caldwell had circulated a memo reassigning the entire ICU schedule. Margaret's assignment to the colonel's room was quietly deleted and reassigned to Nurse Peterson, one of his closest allies, the kind of nurse who nodded and smiled and never questioned an order. The colonel's entire care team was now composed of Caldwell's handpicked staff. No overlap with Margaret. No opportunity. The message was clear, she was being frozen out. But that wasn't the worst part. At 10:30, a second memo arrived. Margaret found it posted on the unit board, her name highlighted in yellow. Documentation of pattern, Nurse Walsh demonstrates concerning attachment to certain patients. Recent incident involving an authorized clinical intervention suggests a pattern of overreach and boundary violation. Recommend psychiatric evaluation and temporary restriction from direct patient care pending review. It was brilliant in its cruelty, not a direct accusation, but a question mark that would follow her everywhere. Psychiatric evaluation. Those words were a brand. Other nurses would read that and assume instability. Patients' families would read that and assume incompetence. Caldwell had filed it with Human Resources at 1015 and copied the Chief of Staff at 1016. By the time Margaret saw it, it was already institutional fact. She'd read it once, standing in the break room while 3 nurses suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, and then she'd folded the memo and placed it in her pocket without expression. Her jaw had clenched, barely visible, just a tightening at the hinge, and she'd walked back to the supply closet where she was now supposed to spend her shift counting medication vials. Inventory duty. Busy work. Exile. The fluorescent light above her flickered like it was struggling to stay awake. Margaret catalogued the morphine ampules, 10 milligrams, 15 milligrams, 20 milligrams, running her finger down the clipboard with the mechanical precision of someone who needed something to do with her hands. The closet smelled of latex and isopropyl alcohol, sterile and suffocating. She could hear the ICU beyond the door, monitor beeps, the rhythmic whisper of ventilators, the distant announcement of a page for Dr. Morrison. Normal sounds. Normal rhythm. The colonel was 3 rooms away, and she might as well have been in another city. Her phone buzzed against her hip. 1,143 hours. A text from her sister, still coming to dinner Sunday. Margaret stared at the message without answering. Sunday felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The morning drained into afternoon like blood from a wound. Margaret completed the inventory by 13:30, submitted it to Caldwell's deputy, and was redirected to restocking the supply carts, work that could have been done by an orderly, designed to keep her moving, away from the patient rooms, away from the colonel. She did it without complaint, her movements efficient and quiet, her presence like furniture in a room nobody was using. 2 other nurses passed her in the hallway. One looked directly at her, then looked away. The other's radio crackled before she could say anything, and she hurried past. At 1,400 hours, the monitors screamed. The sound was the first thing, not an individual alarm, but a chorus of alarms, the kind of unified panic that only meant one thing: code. Margaret's body moved before her mind caught up, the clipboard forgotten, her feet already moving toward the sound. She was moving through muscle memory, the automatic response of a trauma surgeon who'd spent 3 years hearing that exact sound in an ICU in San Diego and 17 years before that hearing it across a burnt-out phi base in Helmand Province. Bed 7. The colonel. Margaret reached the doorway and stopped, taking in the scene with the clarity of someone trained to see chaos as a problem set. The colonel's chest dressing had erupted, not a slow bleed, but a catastrophic rupture. The surgical stitches had torn completely, and blood was flooding the space between his ribs like water filling a basin. His chest cavity was filling. His left lung was collapsing. The monitor's screaming confirmed what her eyes already knew: oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, 88, 82, 76, blood pressure cratering towards systolic shock. Caldwell was in the room, and he was barking orders like someone reading from a script he didn't understand. Get me 2 units of O negative. Increase the saline to wide open. Where is the surgical team? His hands weren't moving. His voice was commanding, but his eyes were uncertain, and the nurses around him were frozen in that specific kind of paralysis that comes from receiving contradictory instructions from someone with authority but no clarity. Dr. Caldwell, one of the nurses, Peterson, said carefully, "Should we page?" I said increase the saline. Caldwell barked, not listening, not seeing, not doing anything useful. Margaret calculated in the doorway. Surgical team ETA from OR, 6 minutes, maybe 7 if the elevator was slow. The colonel's current trajectory, 3 minutes before his heart stopped completely. His oxygen saturation was now at 68%. His blood pressure had dropped to 52 systolic. The monitors weren't screaming anymore, they'd shifted to that higher frequency urgent tone that meant imminent arrest. The crash cart was 12 feet away. The scalpel kit was on the tray. She could see exactly what needed to happen. A field thoracotomy. Left anterolateral incision through the 4th intercostal space, straight into the pericardial sac. Open cardiac massage. Clamp the aorta if there was time. She'd done it 100 times in tents with nothing but a field light and a knife that had been sharpened on a stone. She'd done it on a 19-year-old private named Reeves when the Humvee's armor had failed and the IED had done its work. She'd saved him once. She could save him again. Caldwell saw her in the doorway and his face went hard. "You're not assigned to this patient. Get out." Now! Margaret's hand moved to the dog tag chain at her throat, that tiny piece of metal worn smooth by 20 years of being carried by a man she'd thought was lost. Her fingers traced it for exactly 1 second, and then she released it. The Colonel's oxygen saturation fell to 62. She moved toward the crash cart. Caldwell stepped into her path, his body suddenly animate with authority, with a power he'd been wielding all morning. "I said get out. You're not a nurse on this team. You have no authorization." Margaret stopped. She looked at him with the absolute stillness of someone who had already made her choice and was simply informing him of it. "Then you better call security, doctor. Because I'm not watching him die." Her voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential tone of the morning. It wasn't the measured politeness of the week before. It was the voice of someone who'd just stepped off a helicopter into active fire, and there was no room in it for anything except what needed to happen next. She reached past him and grabbed the scalpel from the crash cart. The blade caught the harsh overhead light like a small silver eye, and in that moment before she moved again, the entire room went dead silent. The monitors kept screaming, but the human sound in the room stopped completely. Caldwell's hand clamped on her wrist. "You're not a doctor. I'll have your license." "Security! Security!" Margaret didn't pull away. She simply met his eyes with the kind of calm that can only come from someone who has already survived worse. "Step back." The Colonel's chest wound opened like a mouth trying to scream. Blood pooled across the dressing, then across the sheets, then across the tile floor in a crimson delta spreading toward Margaret's boots. His monitors shrieked, a sound like a siren trapped inside plastic, oxygen saturation dropping in real time, 92, 88, 74. The surgical team was 23 minutes out. He had 3. Dr. Caldwell stood at the bedside, barking orders that made no medical sense. "Type and cross. Get me 2 units. The blood was already there. Start a second line." They had 3. His voice climbed higher with each command, the pitch of a man who'd never actually saved a life under pressure, only memorized protocols in conference rooms. The nurses froze, some reaching for supplies they didn't need, others simply staring at the monitor as the Colonel's heart rate climbed past 140, his blood pressure collapsing like a building demolition. Margaret moved. She didn't walk. She didn't hesitate. She sidestepped Dr. Caldwell with her shoulder, not rough, not dramatic, just a solid 145 pounds of vector applied at hip height that shifted him 3 feet sideways like he was a piece of furniture in her way. His voice cut off mid-sentence. She reached the crash cart and grabbed the surgical scalpel from its sealed tray, the sterile blade catching fluorescent light as she turned back toward the Colonel's chest. "Stop." Caldwell's voice had gone thin. "You are not authorized." Margaret didn't answer. She tore open the Colonel's hospital gown, her fingers finding the landmarks of intercostal anatomy, the second rib, the third space, the precise geometry between muscle and lung that she'd learned in a trauma tent outside Fallujah when she was 24 years old and already ancient with what she'd seen. Her hands weren't trembling. Her hands never trembled. They moved the way they'd learned to move, with the absolute certainty of someone who understood that hesitation killed. The blade went in. Not into his body, into the space between his ribs, the surgical plane she'd opened 100 times before, muscle memory made flesh. She spread the ribs with her gloved hands, and the incision opened like a book. The nurses gasped. One of them actually stepped backward. The Colonel's thoracic cavity was filling, hemorrhage from the intercostal artery, blood pooling where his lungs should have had space to breathe. "Clamp!" Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave, stripped away every trace of the quiet ICU nurse they'd spent 3 days isolating and humiliating. This was the voice of someone who'd commanded a forward operating base, who'd made life and death decisions while mortars fell and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with copper and cordite. "Now!" The senior nurse fumbled for the vascular clamp. Margaret took it from her hands before she could drop it, reached into the Colonel's open chest, found the bleeding vessel, applied pressure with a precision that looked almost casual. Suction. She directed it with one finger, here, not there, and the blood cleared enough to see. The artery. The bleeder. Damage from the original wound reopening, but salvageable. 2-0 silk. Get me 2-0. They scrambled. A newer nurse knocked over an instrument tray. Margaret didn't look up. She threaded the needle with a surgeon's concentration, her fingers steady as a laser, suturing the damaged vessel with knots that would hold. The colonel's oxygen saturation climbed, 68, 72, 81. His heart rate came down from 140 to 110. The monitor's panic became rhythm again, terrifying normalcy replacing the scream. Dr. Caldwell stood frozen, his mouth open. "You're performing surgery. This is assault. This is, someone call security." Margaret didn't acknowledge him. She didn't even look at him. She was already cleaning the field, already assessing for secondary hemorrhage, already thinking like the trauma surgeon she hadn't been allowed to be for 20 years. The surgical team arrived at the door 3 minutes earlier than expected, moving fast because something in the ICU had changed, something in the ambient air had shifted from chaos to control. The attending surgeon, a man named Morrison, stopped mid-stride. He stared at the open thoracotomy, at the meticulous repair, at the colonel's vitals climbing back toward normal. His eyes moved to Margaret's hands, still moving with practiced efficiency, and then to her face. "Whoever did this," he said quietly, "just saved his life." He didn't ask who. He took over from Margaret, and she stepped back from the bedside with the same careful precision she'd used to step around Caldwell. Her scrubs were covered in blood. The smell of the colonel's surgical site, copper and antiseptic and something deeper, something that smelled like Helmand Province and 20 years of silence, hung on her like a coat she'd forgotten she was wearing. Dr. Caldwell was already on his phone. 3 calls. Margaret heard them as she stood at the sink, washing her hands in water so hot it numbed everything below her wrists. The first call went to the Chief of Staff. "We have a serious protocol violation. An unauthorized surgical procedure. I have documentation." The second to HR at immediate termination for scope of practice violation and assault on a physician. The third to someone she didn't know, some friend on the hospital board, some favor owed or leverage applied, some reason Caldwell had never been afraid of accountability. Within 45 minutes, security arrived at the ICU. 2 guards in Navy uniforms, their badges polished and meaningless. One of them was young enough that Margaret had probably seen him before, the kind of kid who took the job because it felt like authority. The other was older, tired, and actively avoiding her eyes. "Ms. Walsh, we're going to need your badge and your keys." She handed them over without a word. The Chief of Staff appeared as they walked her to the elevators, and he wouldn't meet her eyes either. Caldwell had positioned it perfectly. He documented everything with the precision of a man who understood that the story mattered more than the truth. Unauthorized procedure. Violation of scope of practice. Pattern of insubordination. He had witnesses, staff he'd already positioned to confirm whatever narrative he needed. The surgical team would eventually say Margaret saved the colonel's life. Eventually, that would matter. But first, there had to be an investigation. First, there had to be questions. First, there had to be time for the story to shift. The HR representative met her at her locker with a cardboard box. Margaret's personal items filled it in under 3 minutes, a photograph of the coast near Pendleton, a book she'd never finished reading, a fleece jacket she kept for the break room. She pulled out her ID badge. The photograph was terrible, her expression deliberately neutral, the kind of face you'd forget within seconds of seeing it, and set it on top of the pile. "You're escorted from the premises," the HR woman said, not unkindly. "You should know that Dr. Caldwell has filed a formal complaint, and we'll be conducting an investigation. Until that concludes, your employment is suspended pending termination." Margaret nodded. She'd expected this. She'd been trained for worse than termination. She'd held a teenager's hand while he bled out because the morphine supply was contaminated, and she'd made the decision alone, at midnight, in a forward operating base 200 kilometers from any backup. This was just a hospital. This was just a job. This was just the cost of saving someone's life. By 1600 hours, she was in the hospital laundry room in street clothes. The requirement was absolute: all hospital property had to be returned. She folded her scrubs slowly, the fabric still damp with the colonel's blood, her movements precise and methodical. The pale green cotton, now marked with rust-colored stains that no amount of washing would completely remove. She'd worn these same scrubs for 3 years, and they smelled like every shift she'd worked: medication, sweat, the particular metallic tang of emergency rooms and people who were afraid. She folded them the way she'd been taught at Fort Sam Houston, the way every field medic folded supplies in a combat pack: efficiency and respect combined, the understanding that these things had weight beyond their material composition. Each crease was exact. Each fold was precise. The older woman who ran the laundry room, whose name Margaret had learned over 3 years and whose story she'd never asked, watched in silence. "You're going to be okay," the woman said finally. Margaret didn't answer. She set the folded scrubs on the counter, aligned the corners, and turned toward the service exit. She didn't look back at Sacred Heart. The dog tag chain felt very heavy around her neck, pressed against skin that hadn't felt sunlight in hours, metal that had been carried by another soldier for 20 years, smooth from being held, worn thin from the weight of being remembered. The exit door opened onto the parking lot. 3 days of rain had left everything slick and gleaming, the asphalt reflecting the sky like a mirror held up to a world that had just fundamentally shifted. Margaret walked to her car, a 2009 Toyota with 147,000 miles and a radio that only played AM stations, and she sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. She didn't cry. Crying was the one thing she'd never learned to do, even in the worst moments, even when everything was ending. Instead, she sat in the silence and waited for the next thing to happen, because there was always a next thing, and she'd learned a long time ago that survival wasn't about happiness or victory. It was about being alive when the people you'd saved got to live too. That had to be enough. 3 days passed like water through open hands. The colonel's eyes opened at 1,447 hours on the 3rd day. Not suddenly, gradually, like someone surfacing from deep water, his pupils tracking toward the window where San Diego light slanted across the ICU floor. His hand moved first, fingers curling against the morphine drip, and the attending nurse, a young woman named Sarah who'd been assigned to his care since Margaret's termination, leaned forward to check his pupils. "Welcome back, sir," Sarah whispered. His voice came out like gravel dragged across concrete. "Walsh. I'm sorry. Margaret Walsh. Where is she?" Sarah's hand froze on the fall line. She'd been briefed. Everyone had been briefed. The nurse who'd violated protocol had been escorted out, her badge revoked, her locker cleared. The standard narrative. Caldwell had been thorough about that. "She's no longer with us," Sarah said carefully. The colonel's eyes found hers, and something shifted in his face, a recognition, a calculation. He gripped her wrist with the precision of a man accustomed to command. "Get her." "Sir, I don't think." "It wasn't a request, nurse." "Get her." Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled up Margaret's personnel file on the ICU computer. Her cursor hovered over the termination notice, the red flag Caldwell had left, the documentation of insubordination. And then she scrolled deeper, into the archived documents, the ones from the initial hire packet, the background check clearances. Her breath stopped. There. A DDL 214. Honorable discharge. The document was worn, scanned from a paper copy, but the details were unmistakable. Major Margaret Louise Walsh, United States Army Medical Corps. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart, awarded in Helmand Province, 2004. Medical discharge with disability pension, classified. There was even a combat surgeon certification listed below her nursing credentials, a dual qualification that should have made her untouchable. Sarah read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. Then she called the Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff called hospital security. Within 20 minutes, every administrator in the building knew that Margaret Walsh wasn't just a nurse. Sarah was still holding the phone when the first military vehicle pulled into the parking lot. A Humvee. Black. Unmarked except for a single patch on the door, green beret, 5th Special Forces Group. 2 soldiers emerged, dressed in Class A uniforms with pressed creases that looked like knife cuts. The taller one, a lieutenant colonel with the bearing of a man who'd been through enough to know exactly what mattered, walked directly into Sacred Heart's main lobby at 1645 hours. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of an operational briefing. Every word landed. Every sentence echoed off the polished floors and vaulted ceiling like a solemn oath. I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Mercer, 5th SFG, Fort Campbell. I'm here to inform your administration that Major Margaret Walsh, who you terminated 3 days ago, served 23 years in the United States Army Medical Corps. She earned 2 Bronze Stars for valor under fire. She earned a Purple Heart in Helmand Province. During a single rotation in 2004, Major Walsh saved 43 lives under enemy fire. 43. One of those was Colonel Daniel Reeves, the man you have upstairs. When he was 19 years old, a private, pinned in a burning Humvee outside San Jin, Major Walsh carried him 2 miles through active fire with a broken leg and shrapnel wounds. She delivered him to a medevac point at 0237 hours on October 14, 2004. She then returned to her Phi base to treat 14 additional combat casualties. That man owes his life to her. That man is family. The lobby had gone silent. Visitors stopped moving. A family with a small child stood motionless near the elevator. The volunteer at the information desk had her hand over her mouth. Your hospital terminated that woman because your chief of staff allowed a physician to weaponize disciplinary procedures against her. That physician, Dr. Caldwell, is currently attempting to interfere with federal veterans' protections. That is a federal crime. This conversation is now with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI agents had already entered. Margaret would later learn that they'd arrived at 1644, exactly 1 minute before the lieutenant colonel finished speaking. They didn't announce themselves. They simply walked past him toward the administrative wing, a woman in a charcoal suit flanked by 2 men whose pairing made hospital security step aside without being asked. They found Dr. Caldwell in his office, reviewing his calendar for the next day's surgeries as though nothing had changed. As though a nurse he'd orchestrated the termination of hadn't just been proven to be the most decorated medical professional in the building. His hands were steady when the FBI agents entered, but his eyes registered something, a calculation failing, a scenario he hadn't modeled for. Dr. Caldwell. The woman in the suit showed her badge. I'm Special Agent Catherine Quee, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need to ask you about your computer activity at 1520 hours today. I don't, for my office is private. Your office is institutional property at a hospital receiving Medicare funds. Your computer access logs show an attempt to delete footage from ICU surveillance camera 3. That footage is from 3 days ago. The same day you filed disciplinary action against Nurse Walsh. I'd like to know why you were trying to destroy evidence of her medical performance. A man emerged from behind the agents then, young, Asian American, wearing a Veterans Affairs badge on his lanyard. Marcus Chen, the hospital's IT director, former Marine Corps communications specialist, sat down and opened a laptop on Caldwell's desk. The screen cast blue light across all 3 faces. I preserved every frame, Marcus said quietly. The system flagged the deletion attempt, so it created an automatic backup. This is 1,400 hours, 3 days ago. This is the colonel's chest wound. The video showed, in perfect clarity, the moment the sterile dressing began to darken, then to pool. This is your response, Doctor. Caldwell's voice came through the laptop speaker, panicked, incompetent, somebody get a vascular surgeon. This shouldn't be hemorrhaging. What did the last surgeon do? Who touched this patient? And this, Marcus continued, his voice never raising, is Major Walsh. The video showed a woman moving with the fluid precision of a predator, past Caldwell's outstretched arm, toward the crash cart. Her hands were steady. Her movements were economical, efficient, practiced. She picked up a surgical scalpel. She made a 4-inch incision between the colonel's ribs with one fluid motion. Blood poured out. Her hands moved through it like she was reading a language only she understood. 30 seconds. The bleeding stopped. A tourniquet. Manual compression. Then she reached deeper, into the chest cavity itself, and the screen went to a close-up of her face, of her eyes, of the absolute certainty in them. O2 sat stabilizing, she said, her voice in the video calm, clinical. We have sinus rhythm. Caldwell watched his own video the way a man watches a car crash happening to him in slow motion. Dr. Caldwell, Agent Qui said, why did you attempt to destroy this footage? He opened his mouth. Closed it. The fluorescent overhead light hummed its mechanical drone. I didn't, the protocol, she shouldn't have. You have documentation, Marcus interrupted, pulling up another screen, of attempts to alter Nurse Walsh's personnel file. Adding retroactive disciplinary notices with timestamps that don't match the original system entries. That's falsification of medical records. Federal crime. The handcuffs clicked on at 1,703 hours. Dr. Caldwell's hands, which had spent 23 years signing surgical consents and dosage orders, were secured behind his back by a federal agent who'd seen worse in Kandahar province and knew exactly what competent corruption looked like. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Qui began, and the words echoed through a hospital lobby where the sound of his footsteps, clicking across tile, the squeak of the agent's shoes, the jangle of keys, felt like applause. The hospital board convened that evening. They reviewed the security footage. They reviewed Margaret's DD-214, her combat surgeon credentials, her medical degree from Johns Hopkins, the selective information that Sacred Heart's hiring team had somehow glossed over. The chief of staff, who'd signed her termination papers without reading them, offered his resignation by 2,100 hours. The board accepted it by 21:15. They contacted Margaret through Lieutenant Colonel Mercer, who sat in the ICU waiting room holding her phone number, had been holding it for 3 days, waiting for the colonel to wake up. She didn't answer. By morning, hospital administration had discovered why. Margaret was pulling a night shift at the Veterans Affairs Clinic in El Cajon, 23 miles away, making 40% of her Sacred Heart salary, treating combat veterans with the same precision she'd shown in Helmand Province. She'd walked away. She'd already learned, once, how to disappear. But the Federal Bureau of Investigation doesn't acknowledge disappearance. Within a week, the California Medical Board had launched a formal investigation into Dr. Caldwell. Within 2 weeks, his medical license was suspended pending disciplinary hearing. Sacred Heart filed termination for cause, not voluntary resignation, not retirement, but termination. 2 months later, criminal charges were filed, destruction of federal evidence, falsification of medical records, retaliatory action against a protected veteran under federal statute, 20 years minimum. Margaret received a certified letter from Sacred Heart offering full reinstatement with back pay, 6 months' worth, calculated at her full salary, a formal written apology from the board's president, and an offer of Caldwell's former office, his corner position overlooking the city, his surgical schedule, his authority. She didn't open it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she opened it in the parking lot of the VA clinic, read it once, and left it on the passenger seat of her truck. Then she drove to Sacred Heart. 6 months after the thoracotomy, Margaret walked through the main entrance for a night shift. The automatic doors opened with their pneumatic hiss, and the lobby was the same polished floor, the same volunteer desk, the same geometry of fluorescent light. At the security checkpoint, checking IDs in an ill-fitting uniform that hung on him like borrowed skin, sat Dr. James Caldwell. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. No more. No less. Margaret's badge was laminated and official, her name printed in black letters. She scanned it without looking at him, without acknowledgement, without the mercy of engagement. He was furniture now. He was the background. He was the man she'd moved past, and past him she walked, her scrubs crisp, her stride measured, her composure absolute. That was true class. The Colonel remained at Sacred Heart for 4 weeks of recovery, his room on the 2nd floor, the same ICU where Margaret had saved his life. His first words, when she entered as his assigned nurse, were the simplest ones. "Welcome home, Major." She sat down. Just sat, on the edge of his bed, and something in her face changed, not broke, not cracked, but shifted like a door closing and then opening onto light. The Colonel held up his hand, and in his palm was a single dog tag on a broken chain, worn smooth from 20 years of being carried. "I've been looking for you," he said. "For a very long time." She took the chain. Cold metal against her palm. Familiar weight. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.